Hi pals and welcome to a new video. I'm Kate and today we're talking about a classic that I finished recently that is maybe the best, the most underread and underrated novel of the First World War. A novel that is so close to being utterly perfect, and it is Parade's End by Ford Madox Ford. Let's go ahead and get started. I've split this into three parts: some background on the novel, my review, and then some final thoughts. So first up, a little bit of background on Parade's End. Parade's End is the story of Christopher Tietjens. He is an upper class English gentleman and we follow him before, during and then after the First World War. Parade's End is a modernist work written in the 1920s. It's a light on plot, but is dense as probably anything you would read all year. It has these really long stream of consciousness monologues. It is incredibly psychologically rich, but it's also, I would say, very 19th century in its scope. It's a very long novel, I think around 850 pages. I've heard it described before as the last Victorian novel, which is funny because it is this hybrid between modernism and late 19th century. This is a very challenging read, definitely not a starter classic, but it's also heartbreaking and beautiful, and it's one of those works of fiction that what you put into it will eventually pay dividends. We know the novel today as Parade's End, but it was originally published as a tetralogy between 1924 and 1928, so a cycle of 4 novels. The first of the 4 books is Some Do Not, and that is set in 1911 and 1912, so before the outbreak of the First World War. In Some Do Not, you're introduced to Christopher Tietjens, his wife Sylvia Tietjens, and their family and friends. Some Do Not is really a portrait of the English aristocracy on the brink of war. The second book, and one of my favourites, is No More Parades. This is set in England and on the Western Front during 1916, so about halfway through the First World War. A Man Could Stand Up is the third book. This is set over one evening in the trenches towards the end of the war. This is bleak yet hopeful, and it ends on Armistice Day, the 11th of November 1918. The fourth book is The Last Post, and that is set after the war is finished. Christopher Tietjens is mostly absent from The Last Post, which we'll get to in a little while. Each of those titles reflects a kind of reoccurring motif in that book. My favourite book is A Man Could Stand Up, and the title is taken from a scene where Christopher Tietjens and an officer who are on the front in the trenches over this one night. The officer tells Christopher Tietjens, who is Captain Tietjens at this point, that a man could stand up on a hill. And what he means by that is to have the freedom, I guess, to not be shot at. He tells Christopher Tietjens that he's a law unto himself and that he could stand up on a hill. And that is really a moment of hope for him and hope within the novel. Parade's End is set in England and also on the Western Front. This is a First World War novel, but I would say it's less about the nuts and bolts of war, as more about the impact on someone's inner life and their psychology. The First World War within the novel is also the manifestation of the collapse of a certain type of English civilization, of the end of the Edwardian era. So it's a symptom of a problem rather than being the cause of the problem. The protagonist of Parade's End is Christopher Tietjens. He is a once-in-a-generation genius. He has the most brilliant mind. When we meet him, he is working as a government statistician. He is also the youngest son of a established landed Yorkshire family, the Tietjens of Groby. He is probably one of the most frustrating characters I've followed in any novel ever. He is principled, loyal, sentimental, generous to a fault, but he's also very much a man out of time. Think of an 18th century gentleman trapped in the early 20th century and you'll get the idea. And he is bound by this almost extinct code of chivalry, duty and responsibility. which ensures he is constantly taken advantage of by those around him. Throughout the novel, he is described as the last Tory in England, think kind of high Toryism, or also alternatively as an Anglican saint. One of the great strengths of Parade's End is that the feeling that you're out of sync or adhering to a different moral code, social norms, or behaviours to other people around you is, I think, a universal one that even reading it in 2025 is something that I think people can connect with. He is an incredibly passive character. He's very English, very reserved, very private. In the first book, we meet Christopher Tietjens, and we also meet his wife, Sylvia Tietjens, one of the most unforgettable female characters I've ever encountered in English literature. That's a big statement, but I thoroughly stand by this. This is the second time I've read this novel, and I will say that the second and third books, No More Parades and A Man Could Stand Up, and Sylvia, are the things that I have the most distinct memories of. I can remember lines of Sylvia's and scenes from the Western Front after about, say, 12, 13 years since I last read it. She is a remarkable character. And that is because she's so astoundingly awful. She's an absolute horror, and their marriage is really the marriage from hell. And throughout the 4 novels, Sylvia is really determined to ruin Christopher's reputation, his career prospects, to really isolate him from his friends and from his family. Sylvia is an incredibly complex character, but she really works because she is human enough not to fall into a caricature of a villain or like a femme fatale. She's meant to be this incredibly beautiful woman, but she's also very vindictive, malicious, selfish. She is just such an interesting one. And one of the things that I loved about Parade's End is that over the course of those 4 books, you get this layering of her kind of inner life, of her psychology, so you can kind of understand her motivations, and it gives her character nuance, and it gives her character a certain level of humanity as well. It would have been really easy, I think, to fall into the trap of her just being the kind of villain of the story, but I do think Ford Madox Ford is too clever for that. In the first book, Some Do Not, we meet a vast cast of characters who weave in and out of the 4 books. One of those is Valentine Wannup. She is a key figure in the novel. She is a suffragette and a pacifist, and her family have fallen into genteel poverty. Christopher eventually enlists and is sent to the Western Front and eventually to the trenches at the very front to almost certain death. The heart and soul of Parade's End are the middle 2 books, No More Parades and A Man Could Stand Up. This is where Christopher has enlisted and he is on the Western Front. These 2 books are truly exceptional, some of the best fiction I've ever read. I think that they are a work of genius and the best portrayal of the First World War I've ever seen in fiction. I genuinely adore them, and they're set over a really short period of time, but they have this huge emotional impact. The novel then is the story of Christopher at the Western Front, of what that does to his mind and to his body, what everyone who is left behind is doing. No More Parades is really focused on the loss of dignity and humanity and respect for the men fighting on the Western Front. It's full of Christopher Tietjens' kind of inner monologues, and there's an incredible passage where he's reflecting on the incredibly demoralizing conditions that the soldiers are fighting in and the bureaucratic kind of incompetence that has enabled those conditions. And it is, they could die, they could be massacred by the 250,000 in shambles, but that they should be massacred without jauntiness, without confidence, with depressed brows, without parade. It's such a beautiful passage, and it really captures the essence in No More Parades, that this is the end of an English civilization. that we've lost something that is essentially irretrievable. There are also incredible set pieces in No More Parades and in A Man Could Stand Up. One is the kind of, it's called the Old Pals Party, which is a party for surviving soldiers on Armistice Day, which is the last scene in A Man Could Stand Up. There's also an incredible kind of set to between Valentine One-Up, the suffragette, and her friend who's called Mrs. McMaster, who is the mistress of one of Christopher Teigen's closest friends, which really reveals the cruelty and the unkindness that can exist behind kind of like perfect manners. It's a very kind of melancholy and sad novel, in places quite bleak, but there are moments of kind of hope as well. Those two middle books are the heart and soul of Parade's End, and if Parade's End finished with A Man Could Stand Up, I think I would be sat here telling you that this is the best novel I've ever read, or at least the best novel of the 20th century. I still think it's the best novel of the First World War. However, Parade's End doesn't finish with A Man Could Stand Up, which I feel like is its natural endpoint and is quite a hopeful place to stop. There is a fourth book called The Last Post, and unfortunately I think that is the novel's biggest flaw. The Last Post is a big divider of opinion for people who, like me, really love this novel. Graham Greene, one of my favourite authors and novelists, he actually omitted The Last Post from a 1960s collection of Ford Madox Ford's work, and I have a note in front of me saying that he described it as a disaster that delayed the full appreciation of Parade's End. Virginia Woolf, she's also on my shelves, she also really disliked The Last Post. The Last Post is certainly different from the first three novels. So it's set post-war, it's set in peacetime in England. And in The Last Post, Christopher Teigen is mostly absent from it. You get glimpses of him through the perspective of other characters that you've met previously. It mainly follows Mark Teigen, Christopher's brother, who sees the end of the First World War as a betrayal of France. He believes that to occupy Germany and occupy Berlin is a natural form of justice. We see the last book mainly through his eyes, but Valentine One-Up also comes back into the story. I will say that The Last Post is interesting. It is well written. It just doesn't quite meet the heights of the previous three books. And I would say at the end of the third book, there is a very natural and fitting place for the novel to end. I've definitely read that Ford Madox Ford came to regret having kind of published The Last Post. Some final thoughts. Parade's End is often described as the best novel of the First World War, and I would say it certainly is the best novel of World War One that I've read. I do think that this is a challenging read. It is very dense, often confusing, I think intentionally so. It's definitely a book for those who are up for a challenge and who like reading classics. It is so close to being a masterpiece, but not quite. What I will also say is that this is the second time I've read this with a big gap between the two reads, and I still feel like I've barely even scratched the surface. What I would love to do in the future is come back and read the 4 books over a course of 1 year or 2 years. That's it for today's video. I hope that you've enjoyed this. If you've read Parade's End, I would love to hear from you. If you haven't but you like fiction of the First World War and you have any recommendations, I would love to hear from you also. Or if you just want to leave a comment, they always make my day. That's it for now, and I will see you all in the next video. Bye!